Albert Anastasia called himself a patriot. He served in the United States Army during World War II, trained longshoremen on the East Coast to protect American docks from wartime infiltration, and received U.S. citizenship in 1943 as a reward for his military service. He was honorably discharged in 1944. But while Albert Anastasia wore the uniform and saluted the flag, he was also running Murder Incorporated, an organization responsible for an estimated 400 to 1,000 contract killings across America. He earned two nicknames that defined his legacy: the Mad Hatter for his unpredictable temperament, and Lord High Executioner for his position atop the most efficient enforcement operation in organized crime history. And for nearly 30 years, his family had no idea of the full extent of what happened when he left for work each morning. The immigrant who chose violence. Umberto Anastasio was born on September 26, 1902, in Tropea, Calabria, Italy. His parents were Raffaello Anastasio, a railway worker, and Luisa Nomina de Filippi. The family struggled financially, and Raffaello's death shortly after World War I left Luisa to care for 12 children alone. It was a difficult period, and the older boys understood they would need to seek opportunities elsewhere. At age 15, Albert took a job on an Italian freighter alongside several of his brothers, including Anthony, who would later become a powerful labor leader on the Brooklyn waterfront. When their ship docked at the Brooklyn port in 1917, the Anastasio boys quietly left the vessel and disappeared into the city, leaving Italy behind for what they hoped would be a better life. They found work almost immediately as longshoremen on the very docks where they had arrived. It was brutal, unforgiving labor controlled by criminal organizations that extracted payments from workers and dock owners alike. Albert quickly understood the power structure. He saw how violence, or the threat of it, determined who controlled the best jobs, the best routes, the best opportunities, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wanted to be the one wielding that power, not the one subjected to it. To avoid bringing shame to his family name when he inevitably appeared in newspapers connected to criminal activity, he changed his surname from Anastasio to Anastasia. It was a small gesture toward protecting his family's reputation while pursuing the life he had chosen. By his early 20s, Anastasia had already established himself as someone willing to handle problems other people avoided. In 1921, he was involved in a serious incident that resulted in taking another person's life. He was convicted and sentenced to execution. He spent 18 months on death row at Sing Sing prison. Then, in one of the many mysterious turns that would characterize his career, key witnesses either disappeared or refused to testify at his retrial. The conviction was overturned. Anastasia walked free in 1922, and the pattern was established. In 1928, he was charged with another incident in Brooklyn. Witnesses disappeared or refused to cooperate. The case was dropped. In 1932, he was indicted for using an ice pick in an altercation. No witnesses came forward. In 1933, he was charged in connection with an incident involving someone who worked in a laundry. Again, no one would testify. The message was clear. Those who spoke against Albert Anastasia tended to develop severe memory problems or simply vanished. The enforcer who caught Luciano's eye. Anastasia's reputation for reliability and discretion brought him to the attention of Lucky Luciano, who was then maneuvering to reshape the entire structure of organized crime in New York. In 1930, Luciano finalized his plans to end the Castellamarese War by removing the two old-line Mafia faction leaders, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Anastasia was invited into Luciano's inner circle for this restructuring. On April 15, 1931, Luciano arranged a meeting with Masseria at a Coney Island restaurant. During their meal, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. The moment he left, 4 men, including Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel, entered the dining room and shot Masseria multiple times, ending his life and his control over New York's criminal underworld. No one was ever charged with the incident. With Masseria gone, Maranzano reorganized New York's criminal operations into what would become the 5 families. Anastasia was made underboss of the Mangano crime family. But Luciano understood that Maranzano's ambitions would eventually threaten the stability they were trying to create. In September 1931, Maranzano was himself removed, and Luciano became the most powerful figure in American organized crime. To prevent future power struggles, Luciano established the National Crime Syndicate and the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes and regulate activities across the country. And to enforce the commission's decisions, Luciano created an enforcement arm that would become infamous, Murder Incorporated. Luciano placed Anastasia and Louis Lepke Buchalter, the nation's leading labor racketeer, in charge of this operation. Murder Incorporated operated out of the back room of Midnight Roses, a candy store in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, owned by mobster Louis Capone. The group consisted primarily of Jewish and Italian associates who were available around the clock to handle problems for the commission. During its 10 years of operation, from approximately 1929 to 1941, Murder Inc. was responsible for an estimated 400 to 1,000 incidents across the United States. Many of these cases were never solved. The organization's efficiency came from its structure. The people carrying out the work had no personal connection to the targets, making investigations difficult. Orders came from the top, were transmitted through intermediaries, and were executed by specialists who left minimal evidence. Anastasia's role in Murder Inc. was operational leadership. He selected personnel, approved methods, and ensured that assignments were completed according to specifications. His reputation for effectiveness made him one of the most feared figures in American organized crime. The nickname Lord High Executioner was not given lightly. It reflected his position atop an organization that had perfected the business of making people disappear. But Anastasia maintained a careful separation between his professional activities and his personal life. In 1937, he married Elsa Bargnesi. Together they had a son, whom they named Anthony after Albert's brother. The family lived in Fort Lee, New Jersey, in a substantial home overlooking the Hudson River. Elsa and their son knew Albert worked in legitimate businesses on the waterfront. They did not know the details of his other activities. The underboss who survived everything. When Murder Incorporated began to unravel in the early 1940s, Anastasia demonstrated the survival instincts that would keep him alive for another 15 years. Abe Kid Twist Relis, one of Murder Inc.'s most prolific operators, was arrested and decided to cooperate with prosecutors to avoid execution. Relis provided detailed testimony about hundreds of incidents, naming names and describing methods. His cooperation led to multiple convictions, including the prosecution and execution of Louis Buchalter in 1944. Anastasia understood that Relis represented an existential threat. According to later testimony from informant Joseph Valachi, Anastasia offered a $100,000 reward for Relis's elimination. On November 12, 1941, while under police protection at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Relis somehow fell from a sixth-floor window and died. The official investigation concluded it was an accident or a suicide attempt gone wrong. Many believed otherwise. With Relis gone, the primary witness against Anastasia was eliminated, and prosecution stalled. Anastasia's relationship with his boss, Vincent Mangano, had been deteriorating for years. Mangano resented that Anastasia often handled assignments for Luciano and Frank Costello without consulting him first. The tension created an untenable situation. On April 19, 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared without a trace. That same day, his brother Philip was discovered in a marshland near Jamaica Bay with multiple gunshot wounds. When Vincent failed to appear at his brother's funeral, law enforcement and the commission presumed he had also been removed. Anastasia was called before the commission to explain. He claimed the Mangano brothers had been planning to eliminate him first, and he had acted in self-defense. The commission, which included Frank Costello among its members, accepted this explanation without extensive investigation. Anastasia was confirmed as the new boss of what now became known as the Anastasia crime family. As boss, Anastasia continued the activities that had made him successful as an underboss, but he also began making decisions that alarmed other commission members. He became involved in disputes over territory and business operations. He reportedly began selling memberships in his family for several $1,000s each, a practice that violated traditional protocols. Most significantly, in March 1952, Anastasia made a decision that would eventually contribute to his downfall. He was watching television one evening when he saw an interview with Arnold Schuster, a 24-year-old Brooklyn clothing salesman. Schuster had recently helped police capture Willie the Actor Sutton, a famous bank robber who had escaped from prison and spent years as a fugitive. Schuster appeared on television describing how he had recognized Sutton on the subway and followed him until police could make an arrest. Anastasia, watching this interview, reportedly became enraged. According to later testimony from Joseph Valachi, Anastasia told his associates, "I can't stand squealers. Hit that guy." It didn't matter that Schuster had no connection to organized crime, that Sutton had no association with the Gambino family, or that the incident had nothing to do with Anastasia's operations. On March 8, 1952, Schuster was shot multiple times outside his home in Brooklyn. The incident created enormous public outrage. An innocent civilian who had performed his civic duty had been eliminated for cooperating with law enforcement. Over 4,000 people were interviewed during the investigation, but no arrests were ever made. The other bosses on the commission were furious. Anastasia had drawn massive unwanted attention to organized crime for no strategic reason whatsoever. It was the kind of impulsive, emotional decision that suggested he was becoming unstable, the boss who made too many enemies. Vito Genovese had returned from exile in Italy and was maneuvering to expand his power. He wanted Frank Costello removed as boss of the Luciano family so he could take control. He also wanted Anastasia eliminated because Anastasia's alliance with Costello created an obstacle to Genovese's ambitions. Genovese began quietly building support among the other commission members. He reached out to Meyer Lansky, the financial architect of the National Crime Syndicate. He approached Thomas Lucchese, boss of the Lucchese family. And critically, he approached Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's own underboss. Genovese offered Gambino something irresistible. If Gambino helped orchestrate Anastasia's removal, he would become boss of the family himself. In May 1957, Genovese made his move against Costello. Vincent the Chin Gigante, a rising figure in the Genovese family, was sent to handle Costello. Gigante fired at Costello as he entered his apartment building, but the shot only grazed Costello's head. Costello survived, but the message was clear. Shortly afterward, Costello announced his semi-retirement from active leadership. With Costello neutralized, Genovese turned his attention to Anastasia. The approval process required careful maneuvering. Meyer Lansky, whose opinion carried significant weight, gave his consent. Carlo Gambino agreed to cooperate, understanding that his future leadership depended on it. Joseph Profassi, boss of what would become the Colombo family, was approached about providing the actual operators for the job. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia followed his usual routine. He was driven from his Fort Lee mansion into Manhattan by his chauffeur. His destination was the Park Sheraton Hotel on West 56th Street and 7th Avenue, where he maintained a regular appointment at Arthur Grasso's barbershop. The shop was located in the hotel's ground floor and was a popular destination for businessmen and, discreetly, for individuals in organized crime. A towel was placed over Anastasia's face. His eyes were closed. At that moment, Anastasia's bodyguard and chauffeur, Anthony Coppola, was not at his post. Whether Coppola had been instructed to step away or had simply left on an errand has never been definitively established. Investigation that went nowhere. The New York Police Department assigned over 100 detectives to the case. 14 eyewitnesses had been present in or near the barber shop. The crime had occurred in broad daylight in a busy Manhattan hotel. And yet, the investigation produced no arrests. The weapons used were eventually traced to a batch of revolvers that had been stolen from a shipment headed to Japan, but the trail ended there. Witnesses provided descriptions of the shooters, but identifications were impossible given the masks. The most commonly cited theory, based on information that emerged years later, was that the Gallo brothers from Brooklyn, particularly Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo, had been contracted by Joe Profassi to carry out the assignment. Other sources suggested that the actual shooters were members of Gambino's crew, Stephen Armone and Stephen Stevie Coogan Gramauta, according to information later provided by Gambino capo Michael Mickey Scars Di Leonardo. What was certain was the motivation. Vito Genovese had orchestrated the removal of both Costello and Anastasia to consolidate his power over the commission. Carlo Gambino had cooperated in exchange for leadership of what now became the Gambino crime family. Meyer Lansky had approved because Anastasia's impulsiveness, particularly the Schuster incident, had created risks Lansky was unwilling to tolerate. The commission had sanctioned it because Anastasia had become a liability. His temper, his unauthorized activities, his selling of family memberships, and his tendency to create public incidents had made him more trouble than he was worth. 3 weeks after Anastasia's removal, the commission held a major meeting in Appalachian, New York, at the home of Joseph Barbara. Law enforcement accidentally discovered the gathering when a local officer noticed an unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state plates. The resulting raid exposed the existence of the commission to the American public for the first time and led to decades of federal investigations into organized crime. the family left behind. Albert Anastasia's removal left his family in a difficult position. Elsa was suddenly a widow with a young son, attempting to process what her husband had actually been. The comfortable life in Fort Lee was complicated by the knowledge that Albert's wealth had come from activities she had chosen not to examine too closely. The Fort Lee mansion where they had lived was eventually sold. Comedian Buddy Hackett purchased the property some years later. Albert's brother Anthony, Tough Tony, Anastasio, who had changed the spelling of his surname to distance himself from his brother's notoriety, continued to run the Brooklyn waterfront unions for years afterward. Anthony maintained that he had always operated separately from his brother's activities and that their professional lives never intersected. Whether this was entirely accurate remained a subject of debate. The legacy of Murder Inc. and Anastasia's leadership of it continued to shape law enforcement's understanding of organized crime for decades. The efficiency with which the organization had operated, the geographical spread of its activities, and the effectiveness of its methods became case studies for federal investigators. The fact that Anastasia himself had avoided prosecution for nearly 30 years despite being involved in dozens of serious incidents demonstrated both the power of intimidation and the limitations of the justice system when witnesses could be silenced. Anastasia was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. His headstone bears his birth name, Umberto Anastasio. The barbershop where he died eventually became a Starbucks, one of many businesses that have occupied that corner of the Park Central Hotel over the decades. The chair where he sat no longer exists, but photographs of the crime scene remain some of the most recognizable images in the history of American organized crime. The question that remains: his country during wartime. He received citizenship and an honorable discharge. He lived in a mansion overlooking the Hudson River and appeared to be simply another successful businessman in the import-export industry. But beneath that surface was a man who had helped create and run Murder Incorporated, an organization responsible for hundreds of deaths across America. A man who had participated in the restructuring of the American Mafia in the 1930s. A compartmentalization required to live these two lives simultaneously suggests something about the capacity of the human mind to separate different aspects of identity. Anastasia apparently did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a businessman operating in a particular industry with particular rules. The violence was simply part of the job, no different from any other aspect of running an organization. The other members of the commission eventually decided that Anastasia's particular approach to the business had become too problematic. His removal was sanctioned by the same organizational structure he had helped create in the 1930s. The system that Lucky Luciano had designed with Anastasia's assistance ultimately determined that Anastasia himself needed to be eliminated for the system to continue functioning. There's a certain grim irony in that outcome. The enforcer who had spent decades removing problems for the commission became a problem himself and was handled in exactly the way he had handled so many others. Image of his body on the barbershop floor, surrounded by fallen towels and the implements of an interrupted shave, became iconic. And the family he left behind spent years trying to understand how the man they knew, the husband, the father, the brother, the patriot, could have been the same person described in newspaper accounts as the Lord High Executioner, the head of Murder Incorporated, one of the most dangerous men in America. There's no redemption in Albert Anastasia's story. No moment where he reconsidered his choices. No attempt to make amends. No confession that might have provided closure to the families of those affected by his actions. He lived his double life until the morning he was removed, and when that moment came, it was sudden and final. His wife Elsa passed away years later, having spent the remainder of her life processing what her husband had been. His son grew up carrying a name that was synonymous with violence and organized crime. His brothers continued their own activities, some legitimate, some less so, always under the shadow of Albert's legacy. The Horrifying could be responsible for activities that most people cannot even comprehend. Albert Anastasia lived in plain sight in Fort Lee, New Jersey, worked openly on the Brooklyn waterfront, maintained regular appointments at a Manhattan barbershop, and nobody who wasn't part of his world understood what he actually did until after he was gone. And by then, it was far, far too late.